Hi, everyone. My name is Kelly Doherty. I'm an award winning science fiction and fantasy author with four novel length works under my belt and some short stories, flashes, and poetry published as well. I'm from the land of the midnight sun, Alaska, Eagle River specifically. Thanks for attending the Leeds LGBT Plus Literature Festival and welcome to the workshop titled Brick by Magical Brick: How to Build a Fantasy World. As you know, this is a virtual conference, so you can watch this right on your computer, but this 20-minute workshop is actually pre-recorded, so there can't be any live questions. I've set this workshop up in a question and answer type of conversation, though, so hopefully that's helpful. If you do have any questions, please connect with me on social media. You can find that info in the handout. So, I love fantasy, and I have ever since I was a child. I read every fantasy book I could get a hold of, starting as early as Fraggle Rock and the Chronicles of Narnia, moving through the Harry Potter books, to now reading epic stories like Priory of the Orange Tree and the Darker Shades trilogy. And don't even get me started on movies and games. It was nearly inevitable that I would start writing fantasy stories as well. One thing I found while writing fantasy is the world building aspect can be so overwhelming at first. That got me thinking, how can we make world building less daunting? Maybe other writers are struggling with this idea too. So, are you stressed about your fantasy world building? You've come to the right place. In this Magically mini workshop, learn how to create believable worlds by figuring out what to focus on first, discover tricks on how not to get overwhelmed, and learn some tips on how to sprinkle all those elements into the story. Let's get started. What even is world building? World building is a step that every writer has to do, no matter what genre they're writing in. You get the wonderful opportunity to build the space and the setting your characters are going to be in. You get to create the economy, the geography, the population types and their culture, technology, religion, their history, and more. Basically, you're constructing an entire imaginary world, hence the name. Now, sometimes, depending on what genre you're writing in, this isn't such a heavy lift. A writer of historical fiction, for example, can draw on real world experiences from our Earth past. Similarly, a writer of a literary story set in Boston can actually go to the city of Boston and be in the setting their characters are in. So it really just depends on where your story is actually taking place. Understandably, though, if you're writing science fiction or fantasy, chances are you're gonna have to do quite a bit more world building. But don't let that scare you. World building can be really fun, and as the builder of said world, you can literally think of anything and make it work. As long as you're consistent with the rules you've created, anything goes. How is fantasy world building unique? Fantasy is different than other kinds of world building because of the distinctly fantastical elements you, as a writer, get to play with, namely the magic and dragon elements. Unlike science fiction, which revolves around technology, or horror, which centers on scaring the readers, fantasy writers get to play with a whole new realm, one that has corrupted magic and mythological beasts, wizards who want to rule the world, and magical artifacts that can change the very fabric of life as we know it. With fantasy, as with all the other genres, the amount of world building you're going to have to do is really determined by the type of fantasy you're writing. For example, if you're penning either a magical realism story or a low fantasy, you might not need to do as much world building. That's because both of those subsets of fantasy deal with realism as their core. Both magic realism and fantasy and low fantasy are usually set right here in the real world. You will still have to do some world building, setting up the magic system, for example, but not nearly as much as other subgenres. If you're writing a high fantasy or a swords and sorcery type of fantasy, that's where your world building skills will get their real test. Unlike low fantasy or magic realism, high fantasy and the swords and sorcery fantasy are set in entirely new worlds, meaning not ours, which in turn means you get to create a whole new world from the ground up. And that's where the real fun begins. In fantasy world building, where should we focus on first? So, just like any other element of writing, where you should focus on really depends on you as a writer. I know that's not really helpful, so I'm going to continue that phrase by saying I always start to say with what you're most excited about in your world. Another way to think about this is figuring out what is most important or different about the world that you want to highlight. Some writers like to focus on the historical aspect, how the world came to be, their religions and magical wars, the cultures that came before, the lore. Other writers narrow their gaze to the geography, the mountains and valleys, rivers and oceans, caves and deserts, building the solid ground of the world before putting the people into it. Still, others like to create mythological creatures and their habitats. For me, though, I like to focus on the magic system. Why? Because it's so expansive. It's unique to fantasy, and it's a way to really stress your creativity. If you don't know where to start for your world building, I'd start with the magic. In order to do that, I ask myself a series of questions like, what kind of magic is in my world? What is it used for? Everyday things or only rare circumstances? Is the magic good or corrupt? Does everyone have magical abilities or is it only a select few? If only a few have it, are they blessed or hunted? Is the magic something that's not inherent, something in their blood, but something they have to learn? And if so, where do they learn it? Does it cost anything to use it? For example, in my fantasy series, The Bergen Chronicles, I have 4 types of magic that each correspond with the 4 races. It's inherent, it's in their blood, but not everyone has the same magic or power levels, and it costs the crafter something each time they use it. So I answer all of those different questions and create a magic system with its own rules and guidelines. If you have a really solid idea of the magic in your world, I really think that creating the rest of your world around it will be much easier. One thing to remember is that when you are world building, you're basically creating a set of rules for your world to follow. They're guidelines that you can use to make sure everything you're writing is consistent. When building the magic system, for example, the rules that you create become really important since that'll help the reader understand this fantastical element of your story. You want to make sure the world you're building makes sense, so it has to function with its own set of laws. You're basically creating the boundaries of your imaginary world and everything that's in it. Now, when I'm building a fantasy world, I actually like to have a single document dedicated to that world. That way I can add to it when necessary and have an easier time referencing it later on. I have a section dedicated to each of the bigger factors of the world, which I'll actually talk about now. There are 8 elements that you'll need to flesh out in order to create a believable world. 1. Creatures. So here you'll think about what kind of animals roam your world, both the mythological or legendary beasts like wyverns and the everyday animals, even the types of pets your characters can have. You also get to think about the habitats and if they can do anything really cool and magical. Number 2, magic. This is where you'll brainstorm the magic system, the rules, who has magic, who doesn't, how do they use it, how do they get it, what do they use it for. Number 3, geography. These are things like the landscape, climates, plants, water, air, those kind of things. Some people actually like to make maps to keep everything straight. It's something that I also like to do. And in fantasy in particular, maps have become really popular. Number 4, history. This is both the really big history, like world wars, and also the smaller histories, like what happened in the country your characters are from, or what happened in the village your characters are starting in. Number 5, people. Things like who lives where and why, forming their culture and their language, figuring out if they get along with their neighboring areas, what their religion is, what they value most, those kinds of things. Number 6, social hierarchy. Here, you'll have to determine what kind of government you have, who rules and how, what kind of weapons they have if they go to war, how they deal with crime, politics, their laws. 7, business, like transportation, science, technology, medicine, architecture, even arts. And number 8, everyday life. This is the smaller, nitty gritty kind of stuff like fashion and food and manners. It's a lot, right? Right. So much thought and effort goes into this part of writing. You're creating a whole new world, for goodness sake. Just remember to have fun with it. It can be very easy to kind of get lost in the world building aspect, to plan every tiny little detail about your world and never actually start writing. Or worse still, to plan every little detail of your world and then maybe feel trapped when you do start writing. Just remember, things change. So you don't need to things change. Sorry. So if you do need to change something in your world building document to match the story, don't worry. Things evolve, so just make sure you evolve the world with it. Just make sure your rules are consistent if you do so. Now, I know what you're thinking. There's just so much to do. How do we, as writers, not get overwhelmed? World building can be really scary to someone who hasn't done it before. It's daunting for writers who have done it before, actually, because there's just so much to do. It's the fear of the blank page, 10 times over. So, how do I not get overwhelmed? My first thing that I would say is to start small. You don't necessarily need to know the history of the world or the geography of the entire world or the cultures of all the people living on the one continent when you first start the story. Wherever your character is, wherever you start the story in your world, whether that be in the middle of the desert, in a pub in the city, lost at sea, or even on the back of a wyvern, start from that point of reference. Let's say your character starts their story in the middle of the desert. Okay, so how did they get there? What is the geography around them like? Is your character from around there? Have they seen any animals or people? What are they wearing to combat the heat and also the cold? Once you have that single reference point, you can basically expand outward as necessary as the characters travel from destination to destination. You can also draw on other works for inspiration. Is there a fantasy story with a world you particularly love? Reread that story and see how those writers build those worlds. Don't steal from them, of course, but see how they deal with the world building elements we talked about earlier. And finally, you can also draw on real life. I know this seems like kind of an obvious solution, but if you're really overwhelmed with world building and you just can't seem to start, see if there's a way to draw on real life to get you inspired. Maybe your story starts with a stream running through it or something, and you just can't figure out how to describe it. Go visit an actual stream and jot down what it looks like, how it feels to be there. Does your story start in a tavern, maybe? Go to a coffee shop or a bar if you're old enough and feel the energy, the mood, the conversation. Drawing inspiration from real life is just a wonderful way to world build. And keep in mind, you don't necessarily always have to visit the locations in order to draw inspiration from them. For example, I actually use this quite often in the fantasy book I'm writing right now. My setting is super intensely hot, lava, beach, ocean type setting, and I live in Alaska. I'm so far away from that kind of heat, it's laughable. So I literally just Googled black sand beaches and lava streams and even Hawaii to get into the mood of my setting and my world, to figure out what would be important to my characters who lived there and what kind of vegetation would grow and what couldn't. You can do the same. Now, I know there's so much to say about the world, so how do we as writers sprinkle all those fascinating elements into the story? As writers, we get the massive job of taking all of these really cool elements of world building that we thought of, all the super cool details about magic and trading and the creatures, and figure out what the readers actually need to know to understand the story. Remember, your reader isn't actually getting an omniscient view of the entire world. They're seeing it through your main character's point of view. So everything needs to be honed from that one person or two or three people's story. So use your character's senses when they're exploring their world, all of their senses. For example, if your character meanders through a marketplace, what kind of herbs and meats does she smell? What languages are the vendors shouting at her to get her attention? What colors are used? Showing details like that really immerse your reader into the story and into the world. A great question to ask yourself is, should my reader care about this? If whatever detail you're thinking about adding is important to the main character, or important to the plot, or important to the setting, definitely add it in. But if not, consider leaving it out. For example, going back to the main character in the middle of a desert, things that matter to that character and that story are probably going to be really centered on where they are right now and what they're doing. A character in the desert isn't thinking about their unique governmental agency you've created back in their homeland, unless you make that governmental agency integral to the plot. Maybe the reason why they are in the desert is because they stole a crown and their queen sent one of her assassins to kill them. Then, all of a sudden, the government and the politics and even the geography become important to that story. So you get to decide what is integral and what's not. Another way to sprinkle in the world building aspect is to show it off in dialogue between the characters, because it allows you to showcase what's important to your character and how those values differ from others. And having your character meet other people in the world is also a perfect opportunity to showcase different cultures, especially if your character is from another land or social status. For example, someone from a warring nation would wear different clothes, have different values, even use different languages than someone from a peaceful nation. Someone from an island would just carry themselves very differently than someone who came from a snowy area. Trust me, I'm from a snowy area. I know. One of my favorite ways to sprinkle in the world building is to showcase the world while your characters are traveling. Have your characters traverse a dangerous past that has a terrible history, or sneak past a ruined coastland from a magic fuel war long ended, or maybe even just visit their local tavern for their favorite ale, and then highlight the really cool features of the city along the way. This is a natural way to weave in those elements without drawing too much attention to them. Another super fun way to showcase world building is through food. It's such a commonplace and relatable subject. After all, everyone needs to eat, and we don't all eat the same thing. For example, your main character from the desert would carry vastly different foods than a character who lives in the mountain region. So show it off. Now, remember that not every single detail that you add has to be important with a capital I. The example I gave in the beginning, using all the characters' senses, wandering through a marketplace and smelling the herbs, that might not be super important to the story or to the plot or maybe even to her background. It's a tiny detail, really, herbs and meats, but it is important to keep those little details in to really immerse your readers into the world. Sprinkling in those tiny details while your character is going through their journey builds your world little by little, brick by brick. And remember, you don't and shouldn't include everything you brainstormed in your world building document into your story. It's kind of like that iceberg metaphor we're all familiar with. The readers only need the tip of the iceberg, what's jutting out of the water, to understand the story, but we, as writers, know way more about our world and our characters. Just because you thought of the overarching history of the world or the lore of the magic system doesn't necessarily mean you need to or should include it. Only include what's relevant to the story and that immerses your readers into the setting and into your character's point of view. Save the rest for reference. So, that was a lot. Let's do a quick review. World building is where you're setting up where your story is going to take place. Basically, you're constructing an entire imaginary world, hence the name. Fantasy is different than other kinds of world building because of the distinctly fantastical elements you as a writer get to play with, namely the magic and dragon elements. The amount of world building depends on the type of fantasy that you're writing. High fantasy needs more world building elements than magical realism does. When world building, you're basically creating a set of laws or rules for your world, so your world makes sense to your reader and is more believable because of it. To do so, you'll need to nail down the following factors. There are 8: creatures, magic, geography, history, people, social hierarchy, business, and everyday life. And my suggestion is to start wherever you find the most fun, or maybe to start with the magic. If you're overwhelmed, start small. Use other fantasy stories as inspiration and draw on real life for examples. Sprinkle in the elements of the world using these techniques. Use your character as your point of view to narrow your focus. Ask, should my reader care about this? Use dialogue. Show off different cultures to the characters your main character meets. Show it off through food. Include the world while your characters are traveling. Make sure you include the tiny little details to immerse your readers into the world, but don't include everything. And that's it. It was a lot, I know. World building can be hard. It's a sprawling topic, but it's also really fun, especially as fantasy writers, because we get to play with magic and mythological beasts. It's so cool. We went over a lot in this workshop, so don't forget to grab a copy of the handout link below, where I include a brief overview of what I talked about today. Do you have any tips or tricks on making world building less overwhelming? Let me know. Contact me on social media and on my website, kellydoherty.com. If you want to read some of my work, check out my fantasy novel, Sun-Kissed Feathers and Severed Ties. Keep an eye on my website or social media for more info. And please let me know if you have any questions about this workshop or want some more tips about world building. I'd really love to keep in touch. Thank you so much for participating. Now, go out and create your next magical fantasy world. Or at least start with a tavern. Bye.